There is something fundamentally broken about the liquid in your glass. Right now, you probably believe that clean drinking water is one of the great achievements of modern civilization. You turn on the tap and out comes clear, sanitized water treated with chlorine, fluoride, and filtration systems that cost billions of dollars to maintain. Meanwhile, a medieval peasant drank beer for breakfast, beer for lunch, and beer for dinner, sometimes 4 to 6 pints a day. And here is what nobody tells you. That peasant was healthier, more hydrated, and suffered from fewer waterborne diseases than someone drinking from your municipal water supply today. In 1324, the city records of Nuremberg, Germany show that the average adult consumed approximately 140 gallons of beer per year. That is more than a pint per day, every day, starting at breakfast. Children drank a weaker version called small beer. Pregnant women drank it. Monks brewed it in their monasteries and considered it liquid bread. This was not recreational drinking. This was survival, because the water would kill you, but the beer would not. Fast forward to today. Flint, Michigan, lead contamination. Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, decades of toxic exposure. East Palestine, Ohio, chemical spills. Thousands of American towns have water supplies contaminated with PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, that accumulate in your body and never break down. The Environmental Protection Agency estimates that 45% of U.S. tap water contains at least one type of PFAS. We spent centuries building a water infrastructure that is now poisoning us. Meanwhile, medieval beer, brewed in wooden barrels by illiterate peasants with no concept of microbiology, kept entire civilizations alive and thriving. What did they know that we have forgotten? Before we go deeper, drop a comment and tell us, do you trust your tap water? Do you drink it straight, or do you filter it, or have you switched to bottled entirely? Let us know below, because what you are about to discover will change how you see every glass of water you have ever consumed. Walk into a medieval village at dawn, and the first thing you would smell is the brewery, not the tavern. The brewery, because brewing was not a luxury industry. It was essential infrastructure, as critical as the mill or the blacksmith. In England, every village had at least one brewster, usually a woman, who brewed beer in her home. Larger towns had commercial brewhouses that operated year-round. The beer they produced was not like the craft IPA you drink on a Friday night. It was a completely different substance. Medieval beer was thick, cloudy, and filled with sediment. It had a low alcohol content, usually 2 to 3%, just enough to kill bacteria, but not enough to get you drunk. The grains used were barley, oats, or wheat, whatever was locally available. And here is the key. The brewing process transformed dangerous water into safe hydration through a combination of boiling, fermentation, and natural antibacterial compounds that modern science is only now beginning to understand. Let's break down what actually happened in that medieval brewhouse. First, the water was boiled. This alone killed most pathogens. Bacteria like E. coli, cholera, typhoid, all of them die at temperatures above 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Medieval brewers did not know about bacteria, but they knew that boiling the water was essential. They called it striking the mash. They heated the water until it was too hot to touch, then mixed it with malted grains. Next came fermentation. The grain mixture, called wort, was left to cool in large wooden vats. Wild yeast from the air, the same yeast that lived in the cracks of the brewing vessels, would land in the liquid and begin consuming the sugars. This process produced alcohol, but it also produced something far more important: lactic acid and acetic acid. These acids lowered the pH of the beer, creating an environment where harmful bacteria could not survive. The beer became self-sterilizing. Then there were the hops. Hops were not just for flavor. They are a natural preservative and antimicrobial agent. The compounds in hops, specifically humulones and lupulones, inhibit the growth of gram-positive bacteria. This is why beer could be stored for weeks or even months without refrigeration, while untreated water would become a breeding ground for disease within days. But here is what makes medieval beer truly remarkable. It was nutritious. The grains used in brewing were rich in B vitamins, particularly thiamine, riboflavin, and niacin. The yeast added even more B vitamins, plus trace minerals like magnesium, potassium, and phosphorus. The sediment at the bottom of the barrel was packed with protein and fiber. When a medieval peasant drank his morning beer, he was not just hydrating, he was getting a significant portion of his daily nutrition. Liquid bread was not a metaphor, it was a literal description. Compare that to modern tap water. Yes, it is treated. Yes, chlorine kills bacteria, but what else does chlorine do? It creates disinfection byproducts, or DBPs, chemicals formed when chlorine reacts with organic matter in the water. The most common DBPs are trihalomethanes and haloacetic acids, both of which are classified as probable human carcinogens by the EPA. Long-term exposure is linked to bladder cancer, colorectal cancer, and reproductive problems. You are trading one risk for another. Medieval beer eliminated the risk without creating new ones. And then there is fluoride, added to water supplies in the 1950s under the premise that it prevents tooth decay. But here is what they do not tell you. The fluoride added to your water is not pharmaceutical-grade calcium fluoride. It is hydrofluorosilicic acid, a toxic byproduct of phosphate fertilizer manufacturing. The CDC calls it one of the great public health achievements of the 20th century, but a growing body of research links fluoride exposure to lower IQ in children, thyroid dysfunction, and skeletal fluorosis, a bone disease caused by fluoride accumulation. Countries like Sweden, Germany, and the Netherlands have banned water fluoridation, but in the United States, 73% of the population still drinks it every day. Medieval peasants were not exposed to chlorine, fluoride, or pharmaceutical residues. They were not drinking microplastics that leach from pipes. They were drinking a living beverage full of probiotics, vitamins, and natural antimicrobial compounds, and they thrived on it. To understand why medieval people drank beer instead of water, you have to understand just how dangerous water was. Rivers were open sewers. In London, the Thames was used for drinking, bathing, washing clothes, dumping waste, and disposing of dead animals. All at the same time, wells were contaminated by runoff from privies and animal pens. Even rainwater collected in barrels could become a breeding ground for mosquitoes and bacteria. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, these were not rare diseases. They were constant threats. Cholera alone killed tens of thousands in medieval Europe. Typhoid swept through cities every few years. Dysentery was so common it barely warranted mention in historical records, and the cause was always the same: contaminated water. But here is the fascinating part. Medieval people knew water was dangerous, even if they did not understand why. They had centuries of empirical evidence. People who drank water got sick. People who drank beer did not, so they adapted. Beer became the default beverage for everyone, from infants to the elderly. In 1298, King Edward I of England issued a royal decree regulating the quality of ale. Bakers and brewers were subject to strict oversight because bread and beer were considered equally essential to public health. The assizes of bread and ale established standards for purity and quality. If a brewer sold contaminated ale, they faced public humiliation, fines, or imprisonment. The government understood that clean beer was a matter of life and death. Monasteries took brewing even more seriously. Monks were among the most skilled brewers in medieval Europe. They brewed beer not just for themselves, but for pilgrims, travelers, and the poor. Monastic brewhouses were built with advanced drainage systems, separate water sources for brewing and waste, and temperature-controlled cellars for fermentation. The Benedictine order, in particular, perfected the art of brewing. Their beer was so renowned that secular brewers tried to copy their methods. And here is something most people do not know. Monks brewed different strengths of beer for different purposes. The strongest beer, called prima melior, was reserved for the abbot and special guests. Medium-strength beer, called secunda, was for the monks themselves. And the weakest beer, called tertia, was given to the poor and travelers. But even the weakest beer was safer and more nutritious than any available water. The brewing process also had a hidden benefit. The spent grains left over after brewing were fed to livestock. Cows, pigs, and chickens thrived on the nutrient-rich mash. This created a closed-loop system where nothing was wasted. The water was purified through boiling and fermentation. The beer nourished people, the spent grains fed animals, and the animals provided meat, milk, and eggs. Medieval brewing was not just about making a beverage. It was a cornerstone of the entire agricultural economy. Now contrast that with modern water treatment. Municipal water systems draw from rivers, lakes, and reservoirs. That water is contaminated with industrial runoff, agricultural pesticides, pharmaceutical residues from human waste, and microplastics. Treatment plants use chlorine or chloramine to disinfect the water, but these chemicals do not remove everything. Heavy metals like lead and copper leach from aging pipes. Cryptosporidium and giardia, parasites that cause severe gastrointestinal illness, are resistant to chlorine. And PFAS, those forever chemicals used in firefighting foam and nonstick coatings, cannot be filtered out by conventional treatment methods. In 2023, a study by the U.S. Geological Survey tested tap water from 481 locations across the United States. 45% of samples contained at least one type of PFAS. These chemicals are linked to cancer, liver damage, immune system suppression, and developmental delays in children. And because they do not break down, they accumulate in your body over time. You are not just drinking today's contamination. You are drinking decades of accumulated pollution. Medieval beer had none of this. The water was boiled, the fermentation killed pathogens, the hops preserved it, and the result was a beverage that was safer, cleaner, and more nutritious than anything coming out of your tap today. Let's get into the science of why medieval beer worked, because this is not folklore, this is biochemistry. When you ferment grains, you are creating a complex ecosystem of microorganisms that transform the liquid at a molecular level, and every step of that process makes the beer safer and more digestible. First, yeast. The species used in brewing, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, is one of the most studied organisms in science. When yeast consumes the sugars in the wort, it produces ethanol and carbon dioxide. The ethanol, even at low concentrations of 2 to 3%, is enough to kill most harmful bacteria. But yeast does something else. It produces compounds called esters and phenols that give beer its flavor, and more importantly, it synthesizes B vitamins. Thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and biotin are all created during fermentation. Medieval people drinking beer were getting a vitamin supplement without even knowing it. Next, lactic acid bacteria. These bacteria, primarily from the Lactobacillus family, thrive in the acidic environment created by fermentation. They produce lactic acid, which lowers the pH of the beer to around 4 to 4.5. At this pH level, pathogens like E. coli and Salmonella cannot survive. The beer becomes hostile to disease. This is the same principle behind fermented foods like sauerkraut, kimchi, and yogurt. Fermentation is a form of biological preservation. Then there are the hops. Hops contain alpha acids, primarily humulone and lupulone, which are antimicrobial. Studies have shown that these compounds inhibit the growth of gram-positive bacteria, including Staphylococcus aureus and Listeria monocytogenes. In medieval times, brewers did not understand the chemistry, but they knew that beer made with hops stayed fresh longer. Hops were added not just for bitterness, but for preservation. But here is where it gets really interesting. Fermentation also breaks down anti-nutrients. Just like the phytic acid in bread, grains contain compounds that interfere with digestion and nutrient absorption. Fermentation neutralizes these compounds. The enzymes produced by yeast and bacteria break down complex starches into simpler sugars, making the beer easier to digest. The proteins are partially hydrolyzed, reducing the risk of allergic reactions. By the time the beer was ready to drink, it had been pre-digested by microorganisms. Compare this to modern bottled water. Bottled water is not living. It is sterile. It contains no beneficial bacteria, no vitamins, no minerals beyond trace amounts. In fact, many bottled water brands are just filtered tap water. Studies have found that bottled water often contains microplastics, leached from the plastic bottles themselves. A 2018 study by the State University of New York tested 259 bottles of water from 11 different brands. 93% contained microplastic contamination. You are drinking plastic particles with every sip, and those plastic bottles are not inert. Polyethylene terephthalate, or PET, the plastic used in most water bottles, leaches chemicals like antimony and bisphenol A, or BPA, into the water. These chemicals are endocrine disruptors, meaning they interfere with your hormones. Long-term exposure is linked to reproductive issues, metabolic disorders, and certain cancers. Medieval beer was stored in wooden barrels or ceramic jugs. No plastic, no leaching, no hormone disruption. In 2008, researchers at the University of Pennsylvania analyzed residue from ancient pottery jars found in China. The jars dated back 9,000 years, and the residue contained traces of fermented beverages made from rice, honey, and fruit. This is the oldest evidence of brewing in human history. But here is the key finding. The fermentation process had created antimicrobial compounds that would have made the beverage safer to drink than untreated water. This is not medieval. This is Neolithic. Humans have been using fermentation to purify water for nearly 10,000 years. In medieval Europe, the evidence is even more direct. Parish records from 14th century England show that villages with active brewhouses had lower mortality rates during cholera and dysentery outbreaks compared to villages that relied on well water. The correlation was so strong that local governments began mandating the construction of communal brewhouses as a public health measure. Then there is the case of the Trappist monks. In 1836, a cholera epidemic swept through Belgium, killing thousands. The monastery of Westmalle, home to Trappist monks who brewed their own beer, had 0 deaths. Not a single monk contracted the disease. Meanwhile, nearby villages that drank well water were devastated. When investigators examined the monastery's water supply, they found it was contaminated, just like the village wells. But the monks did not drink the water. They drank their beer, and the beer saved them. Modern studies confirm what medieval people knew instinctively. A 2015 study published in the journal Food Microbiology tested traditional fermented beverages from around the world. The researchers found that fermentation consistently reduced or eliminated pathogenic bacteria, including E. coli, Salmonella, and Listeria. The study concluded that fermented beverages were a reliable method of water purification in pre-industrial societies. And today there is a quiet resurgence. Craft brewers are reviving medieval brewing techniques. They are using open fermentation, wild yeast, and traditional grains like spelt and emmer. These beers taste different, more complex, more earthy, but they also contain live probiotics, natural enzymes, and higher nutrient levels than commercial beer. Some brewers are even marketing their products as functional beverages, emphasizing the health benefits of traditional fermentation. The decline of beer as a staple beverage began in the 19th century with the rise of public water systems. In 1854, a cholera outbreak in London killed over 600 people in a single neighborhood. A physician named John Snow traced the outbreak to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street. His investigation proved that cholera was a waterborne disease, not an airborne one as previously believed. This discovery led to the development development of modern sanitation and water treatment systems. Cities began investing in infrastructure. They built reservoirs, aqueducts, and filtration plants. They treated water with chlorine to kill bacteria, and for the first time in human history, clean drinking water became widely available. It was a genuine public health triumph, but there was a cost. The reliance on centralized water systems made populations vulnerable to infrastructure failure. When the system works, it works well, but when it fails, the consequences are catastrophic. Flint, Michigan is the most well-known example. In 2014, the city switched its water source to the Flint River to save money. The river water was more corrosive than the previous supply, and it leached lead from aging pipes. For 18 months, 100,000 residents, including 8,000 children, drank water contaminated with lead. Lead poisoning causes irreversible neurological damage, especially in children. Government knew about the problem and covered it up. It took lawsuits, protests, and national media attention to force action. But Flint is not unique. A 2016 investigation by USA Today found that nearly 2,000 water systems across the United States had lead levels higher than the federal action limit. These systems serve over 6 million people, and lead is just one contaminant. Arsenic, nitrates, perchlorate, and radioactive elements like radium are found in tap water across the country. The infrastructure is crumbling, the regulations are inadequate, and the problem is getting worse. Meanwhile, the bottled water industry has exploded. Americans spend over $18 billion per year on bottled water. But here is the irony. Much of that bottled water is less regulated than tap water. The FDA oversees bottled water, but testing requirements are minimal. A 2019 study by Consumer Reports found that several popular brands of bottled water contained arsenic levels higher than federal limits. And as mentioned earlier, 93% of bottled water tested positive for microplastic contamination. We traded a decentralized, resilient system of local brewing for a centralized, fragile system of municipal water. We traded a living beverage full of probiotics and nutrients for sterile, chemically treated water that contains contaminants our bodies were never designed to handle. And we wonder why autoimmune diseases, hormonal disorders, and gut health issues are skyrocketing. Medieval beer was not perfect. It was not sterile. It was not crystal clear. But it was safe, nutritious, and sustainable. You did not need a billion-dollar treatment plant to produce it. You needed grain, water, yeast, and time. Every village could produce its own. If one brewery failed, others continued. The system was resilient because it was decentralized. If you want to drink like a medieval peasant, you have 3 options. First, brew your own small beer. This is simpler than you think. You do not need fancy equipment. You need malted barley or wheat, which you can buy online or at homebrew supply stores. You need water, you need yeast, and you need patience. Here is the basic process. Boil water and steep the grains for about an hour. This extracts the sugars and sterilizes the water. Strain out the grains and let the liquid cool to room temperature. Add yeast and cover the container with a cloth to keep out insects while allowing air to flow. Let it ferment for 3 to 5 days. The result is a low-alcohol, slightly sour beverage that is safe to drink and full of probiotics. You can flavor it with herbs like rosemary, thyme, or even spruce tips, just like medieval brewers did. Second, invest in a high-quality water filter. Not all filters are created equal. Carbon filters remove chlorine and improve taste, but they do not remove heavy metals, fluoride, or PFAS. Reverse osmosis systems remove almost everything, including beneficial minerals, so you will need to remineralize the water afterward. The most effective option for removing PFAS is activated carbon combined with ion exchange resin. These systems are expensive, but they are cheaper than a lifetime of bottled water and far better for your health. Third, drink fermented beverages. Kombucha, kefir, and traditional kvass are all modern equivalents of medieval small beer. They are fermented, probiotic-rich, and safer than sterile bottled water. Look for brands that use minimal sugar and traditional fermentation methods, or better yet, make your own. Kombucha is brewed by fermenting sweetened tea with a SCOBY, a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. The process takes 1 to 2 weeks, and the result is a tangy, effervescent drink that supports gut health. The point is not to live like a medieval peasant. The point is to recognize that their solution to unsafe water was more effective and more sustainable than ours. They used biology to purify water. We use chemicals. They created a living ecosystem in every barrel. We create sterile, lifeless liquid that requires constant infrastructure to maintain. If you are learning something valuable here, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us share this forgotten knowledge with more people who are tired of being told that modern is always better when history proves otherwise. The medieval peasant, with his morning pint of cloudy, nutritious beer, was not ignorant. He was working with a system perfected over thousands of years, a system that turned contaminated water into safe hydration without chemicals, without infrastructure, without billion-dollar treatment plants. We traded that system for convenience. We built centralized water systems that fail when budgets are cut or pipes corrode. We allowed corporations to sell us plastic bottles filled with filtered tap water and microplastics. We fluoridated our water based on flawed science from the 1950s, and refused to admit the harm it causes. Medieval beer was food. Your bottled water is a product. The choice is yours. The secret was never lost. It was just buried under a century of industrialization and corporate marketing. And every time you boil water, ferment grains, or choose a living beverage over a sterile one, you reclaim a piece of that ancient knowledge. Knowledge that kept people hydrated and healthy when water was a death sentence. Knowledge that still works today. Subscribe, and let's keep digging up what they buried.